Good day and welcome to another episode of Colorado Conversations. Our guest today is Scott Wasserman, who is the president of the Bell Policy Center and the Bell Action Network, although Scott here is not representing those two organizations. Rather, he is here joining us in his personal capacity to talk about something that's very personal to him, but also quite incredibly important to our society, and I dare say the rest of the world. Now, Scott previously served as Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor John Hickenlooper and as Chief of Staff to both Lieutenant Governor Joe Garcia and Lieutenant Governor Donna Lynn. Scott also spent 8 years in leadership positions at SEIU and at Colorado Winds. He has worked as a lobbyist and served 4 years as Director of Communications and Press Secretary for the State House Minority Office. Scott is a graduate of George Washington University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in Middle East Studies. And Scott, again, thank you for joining me this morning. I think I'm going to start by asking you to tell a little bit about your family's history. You told me once before that your family escaped, the pogroms, if you will, and got to the United States.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I really, as always, appreciate talking to you and talking to you about these issues that go beyond the politics of the day. Look, my story, what's so interesting is that I think my family story is not terribly unique. We, like many Jews who lived in Eastern Europe at the end of the 20th century, ultimately found refuge in America following the very violent pogroms that occurred in Russia and the Pale of Settlement. In fact, my grandfather, and I only kind of know this through doing my own ancestry.com journey, that my grandfather was actually born in 1903, the year of one of the most infamous pogroms that took place in Kishinev, what is now Moldova. But he actually was raised in Kishinev. I think that, so for me and my family, America was a place of refuge. And it was, I think growing up, I was very aware of the fact that my father was a first generation American. He grew up speaking Yiddish and Russian, didn't learn English until later on in life. And so, I think that my story is one of, feeling comfortable in America, but also recognizing that there's something very different about us, ethnically, culturally, nationally. I think that, reflecting on those experiences, and maybe we'll talk about it, I think it is really, hammered home what a refuge the liberal democracy and the liberal Democratic Republic of America is for Jews who were fleeing illiberal places and ultimately found a home here. And so, that's my background. And part of what, I've been reflecting on in the days since October 7th and sort of this larger debate that has emerged around Jewish history and kind of where we fit in the world.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Brief summary, very brief summary of your family's history. You describe yourself as a liberal. And do you mean classic liberalism? And how do you define that in the context of American politics?
Yeah, I think something really interesting has been happening. If you had asked me 5 years ago where I stood politically, I would have described myself as a progressive. I would have talked about, we would have talked about, I'm a Democrat versus a Republican. I'm not a conservative. And I don't think anything has necessarily changed about my political opinions or my policy preferences. But I think something that has really become important, and I think there are a number of people who I've been dialoguing with for whom the idea of classic liberalism has become really important. And when I say classical liberalism, what I mean is living in a tolerant society and recognizing that that is a paradigm shift, that prior to the emergence of liberalism, people lived in countries and societies in which tolerance was hard to come by, in which your religion, your politics, your cultural preferences were all subject to judgment. And if you did not align with the predominant belief system of the country you lived
The
in,
orthodoxy, if you will.
the orthodoxy, then you would live in the margins in an untolerated state. And so as I reflect upon everything that's going on in America right now, I think something that has become so important, and I was feeling this way even before October 7th, is that, liberalism is the thing we have to protect. That we can all have our policy differences, we can all have our political differences, but if we get into a place where intolerance of any kind becomes the dominant theme, then particularly as Jews, we are in trouble. And I think that's also reflecting upon the Jewish experience in Europe in the 1800s, where many Jews, suddenly after the Napoleonic, revolutions, were welcomed, after the French Revolution, were welcomed into European society, emancipated, if you will, made to be citizens, and by the early 1900s were rejected, were kicked down. And so, I think I've just been reflecting a lot on how important liberalism is, what it means to have lost it, and what it means to fight for it.
And correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it's very hard to define what classical liberalism is, but and again, correct me if I'm wrong. It really is the philosophical viewpoint, if you will, theory, if you will, that advocates for, among other things, religious liberty, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, economic freedom, the rights of property, yes, division of government's powers, the importance of an independent civil society. And I think in American society, starting with Theodore Roosevelt, it still has those underpinnings, but I think we can add to it some sort of a preference for government intervention to help, let's say, low income and middle class, citizens through taxation, regulation. You can even add to the mix, concern for civil rights and civil society. I get that one broadly correct.
I probably would split some hairs because I think that I think what's been interesting is I've had conversations with folks is that you kind of have to spend some time disconnecting our vernacular, right, where we kind of throw out the word liberal, right? Like I'm a liberal or they're a liberal. And I think everything you described in the latter half of that explanation, right? That's what like a liberal is. But what I think we need to return to is that before you can get to like kind of MSNBC liberal or, Democratic liberal, there's a much more fundamental social contract, right? Which is, and it should be a social contract that both Republicans and Democrats, that both folks on the left and the right can agree to, which is we're going to live in a tolerant society, right? We are not going to be in a situation where it's my way or the highway, or, we require you to pass particular purity tests in order for you to be a part of functioning society. Everything else is like 2.0. But I think there's just the most basic fundamental social contract that we don't have a king, there is no formal religion, and that so long as you're not hurting anybody, you should be able to have whatever viewpoint you want and voice it however you want.
Got it. Okay, so I think that brings us to the October 7th attack by Hamas that killed 1,200 people, kidnapped 250 people. About 100 of them, reports say, are still hostages right now. Now, I wonder, it's been described as the most horrific attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And I wonder if that changed you, and if it did, how?
Well, first of all, it was a gut-wrenching event. I remember waking up, I remember hearing about it, I remember realizing as the news was coming in, the scale of the attack. This was not just a terrorist attack. This was on a level that was inconceivable for anyone who had ever paid attention to the issue, cared about Israel, cared about the Palestinians, that this was something fundamentally new. I think what was really disorienting and what was really concerning almost immediately after October 7th was that there were those in America who didn't say, that was horrible. I care about the people in the region. I have questions about the politics of that region and the conflict, that there were people who said, what was Israel even doing there, right? That their reaction was not a reaction of disgust about the event. It was somehow putting the blame on Israel, on Zionism. And, I want to be clear, and we'll talk about this later. I'm extremely critical of the current Israeli government. I'm extremely critical of what this war has turned into. But if your initial reaction on October 8th was to somehow say that the attack was warranted, or that this was somehow Israel's fault, or Israelis shouldn't have been there, that was deeply concerning to me, because it said to me, wait a minute, there are people who have fundamental questions about whether or not a Jewish state should even exist. And that Jews in America who just frankly, learned that their cousins had been murdered and taken hostage were somehow suspect, that our affiliation with the Jewish people, that our connection to the people of Israel, and that our belief that Jews should have a homeland of their own, that suddenly we were suspect. And I think what we've seen is that movement has grown since October 7th to be increasingly illiberal and illogical, right? Going so far as to say, that, if you're a Jew who, is opposed to the war and supports Palestinians, well, you're okay. But if you're a Jew who, with history in mind, believes that there should be a Jewish state, that somehow you and your views should be banished from the public discourse. That's like really concerning. And to be clear, before October 7th, and this because you had moderated at least one debate that I had with someone else.
I remember. Yes.
I was really worried about a liberalism from the right before October 7th, right? That there were, in my view, people who were espousing a form of Christian nationalism, who were saying that if you weren't, if you weren't supportive of certain values and certain viewpoints, then you did not have a legitimate role in this democracy or this republic. And so I think after October 7th, suddenly the Jew becomes a pawn again in a larger political game. And that is kind of where I feel like we are 200 days after October 7th, is that, on the right, we are hearing, this almost clash of civilization like defense of Israel's actions, and, this sort of casting all Palestinians as somehow, evil. On the left, we are hearing that, Israel is a Zionist regime and is a form of fascism, and America should not be an ally. And I think what's just really struck me and frustrated me is like, where is our agency and our autonomy as Jewish people in this discussion? And it feels to me like on both sides of the divide, there is this new illiberalism that says, well, here's how Jews fit into our worldview, right? And so, on the left, what we're hearing is we would prefer Jews who don't have a relationship with the state of Israel, who don't believe in Zionism, and who favor our policies and ideas. Well, they're welcome in my America. And then on the right, what we're hearing is, well, we love Jews because of their, faith in the Bible and their religiosity, and we have common values. And if they support Israel and they're opposed to the protesters, then we accept them. And so what I call this is the game of good Jew, bad Jew. And I think what people maybe don't appreciate is anti-Semitism. It's not just hate, right? Anti-Semitism is when you have a story and Jews play a role in that story, and that can change. Sometimes in that story, Jews are in power and are the elite. And in other versions of that story, we are the weak trying to cause consternation and rebellion. And either way, the bottom line and what concerns me is that in either one of those worldviews, there's a scenario in which I am not acceptable, and in which I should not be included in society, in our politics, and that if I look back on history, that the warning lights are on, right, and that we have reached a period of foment and illiberalism.
you know, and correct me if I'm wrong here. What I saw immediately after October 7th is that I saw several organizations on the left, broadly speaking, that basically pointed to Israel and said, you're to blame. And on the right, what we saw, as you just noted, is an immediate, clear, unequivocal defense and saying, we're going to stand by Israel, do what you must, conduct the war however you see fit, we stand by you. And and we've seen stories about how uh, uh, Jewish Americans who are on the left, broadly speaking, liberal, progressives, Democrats, find themselves, as you kind of noted, isolated from the group of people that they had for a really long time been working with. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And I remember very clearly, especially in the first couple months, that it got so bad that Jews who identify as Democrat and who had been involved had to write a letter saying that it is not okay for the Democratic Party or Democratic elected officials to be, lambasting or painting with a broad brush Zionism. It's not okay to, basically alienate and one side this entire story and narrative. And I mean, look, this didn't come out of nowhere. And I think what's probably concerning for me and a lot of others is that maybe there had for a long time been people who weren't saying the quiet part out loud. When I 2 years ago went to Israel and came back and was showing friends and colleagues pictures from my trip or talking to them about experiences, were they leaving the room and saying, that filthy Zionist, I can't believe he supports the state of Israel, right? And so I think what it said to me was, we've skipped a step, right? That we've had many conversations about the economy, reproductive health, civil rights, all forms of justice, but somehow lurking beneath the surface was a deep suspicion of Jews, their relationship with Israel, and their perspective on history and what that means for our future. And I think, look, and I want to be super clear here, I come at Israel with a very nuanced perspective. There are a lot of things that occur and have occurred in Israel that I find deeply concerning. But the first gate of entrance into a conversation has to be, you accept that this state exists, is legitimate, and that Jews deserve a home. And I don't think that there is sufficient understanding of Jewish history and the fact that, and we talked about my family's history, we were the lucky ones to be able to go to America in 1917 before the Anti-Immigration Act was passed in 1924. For the millions of Jews who were fleeing the Holocaust, they had nowhere to go. I don't think that this is understood. And I don't think people understand the politics of the region and how two different peoples came to exist in this land and the history that has come after that. But we are where we are. And so denying fundamentally a people's right to exist in their own country, to me, is a deeply illiberal thing. And then to castigate members of that people who live in this country for supporting or believing in that project and saying that we should somehow be marginalized and that we should be pushed out of polite society, that's also deeply illiberal.
I always thought that everybody could, if you're going to the university, everybody should take 20th century history at the least, because that's when, that's the bloodiest century. That's also when all kinds of ideologies come to a head, if you will. And we've seen that, in many parts of the world. Now, so let's talk about the pro-Palestinian protests that have erupted, across the country. We've seen that in Denver. And on Friday, the university officials decided, okay, we're gonna send in the police. We've asked the protesters to take down the encampment, the tents, send in the police. They arrested about 40 people. It took the encampments down. By the way, the encampment is back. Right? It's about 40 tents last time we checked, something like that. You wrote on Twitter, you said these crackdowns on campus protesters are completely unacceptable. Their rhetoric goes far beyond calls for peace, verging on hostility to my very existence, but smothering their voices undermines the liberal democracy that protects my right to exist in the first place. How do you draw the line? You talk about warning lights coming on, right? How do you draw the line? You know, we've been to our I mean, our reporters have been to the protest. You know, we hear them chant, for example, you know, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Look, I mean that this is what a liberal democratic society has to do. You know, I support their right to protest, just like I support the right of Second Amendment gun-toting knuckle draggers, from my perspective, who say horrible things that I feel threatened by. Right? I mean, I think that shutting down those what purpose does shutting down those protests do? All you're going to end up doing is further radicalizing those students, perpetuating their belief that they're under the thumb of an oppressive government. I don't think that those viewpoints are going to go away, right? I mean, just because you shut down a protest and arrest everybody doesn't mean that those ideas don't go away. In fact, I would argue they probably get a little bit more dangerous. And I believe very strongly that that this is part of the social contract, right? And that you have to be able to tolerate hearing what other people have to say, even though you may find it challenging. I also quibble with the idea that these protests are de facto anti-Semitic. I chafe greatly at their characterization of Zionism, and perhaps we can talk a little bit more about that. But to me, I think the ADL, I think that many of the mainstream Jewish organizations, I don't think it's that they're overreacting. I think that they are misreacting. I think that in their rush to call these things anti-Semitism, they're making it harder for us to build bridges between these communities. And so, I mean, I guess from my perspective, the last thing I want to see is violent crackdowns that just further a narrative that we're hearing from the left. Now, I saw today that the protests at Columbia University have moved to a different direction, where they're actually breaking into administrative buildings, where they're breaking windows. Yeah, so now I think that I do think, right, that a crackdown of that kind of behavior is acceptable. I think the issue for me, and this is what's so frustrating, is I want to join these protesters. Listen, I told you earlier, I went to Israel 2 years ago. The only reason we went to Israel is because Bibi Netanyahu was no longer prime minister of the state of Israel, and I had been boycotting it for the last 7 years, much to my wife's chagrin, right? I want to be in common cause with many of these protesters. I am opposed to what Israel has decided to do in the days following October 7th. But I cannot stand next to a protester who is also saying that they want to see the destruction of Tel Aviv, or that they want to rewind history back to 1947.
Or send the Jewish people back to Poland, for example.
Right, which we heard from, Jill Stein, which might be the stupidest comment I've ever heard from an American politician, right? So I think to me, in a way, that's the anti-Semitism is, well, we don't want you here, right? I mean, and I think that, and I'm not alone. I can think of at least a dozen other folks who feel very much the same way as me. And our feeling is you've made it either willfully or unintentionally impossible for us to join these protests and form solidarity with you, because every statement that comes out of their mouth somehow, like, and I took this up with Representative Tim Hernandez and still haven't heard back from him. I said, when you say free Palestine, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Do you mean free the Palestinians that live in the occupied territories? Because if that's the case, I'm with you. And I've been at this for 20 years. But if what you mean when you say free Palestine is to rewind the clock before partition, before all the history, then I couldn't be more offended. And what disturbs me is that I don't get a response, that there really does seem to be this almost joy in the ambiguity. Well, you're just going to have to guess, aren't you?
Well,
So, look, I'm disgusted, I'm frustrated, I'm angry, but no one is served if we shut these down. And I think it just makes the situation worse.
well, is it is it ambiguous to you when you hear the chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? I mean, ADL would look at that as from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea and view it, and many do, as the complete annihilation of the state of Israel.
Yeah, I mean, look, like I said, I mean, I think the protesters have certainly not tried to clear things up, right? And so, it's very difficult for me to go and litigate slogans, and I think that there's a danger in that. But I think that those were the concerns that I talked about early on, where Democrats, just Jewish Democrats, like asking for clarification. Don't police my words, right? So I think, when I reflect on some of the lessons from the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, we should be, weary of microaggressions and be careful about triggering people. Well, you're triggering me when you say, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. And I don't think it's unreasonable for me to ask you what you mean. And you're right. I unfortunately, like many of my friends and colleagues, have walked away saying, I know exactly what you mean. Right. And yeah, I find that really frustrating. And that's why I think relationships have really been destroyed here, because there seems to be this wanton, unwillingness to clarify things. And yeah, it can only, and it leaves me defenseless when I talk to someone perhaps on the right, or someone who is a little bit more sensitive on these issues, to say that that's not what they mean. And so I take that to mean, quite honestly, I don't know if I can swear on your show, but a big F you, right? I don't care what you think. I'm going to say what feels good to me or what I believe. So that's really concerning. The right does this kind of thing too, and it's really concerning to see it on the left.
You talk about the right, and as I mentioned earlier, there's an unequivocal support for Israel. And in fact, at the debate that we went to at Colorado Christian University, they did a prayer vigil, and they raised money for a Jewish emergency operations organization in operating in Israel. Let me ask you, what is an there might not be an answer, but what is the way forward now? That's one. Second question is, what is your message to the student protesters? I understand some of those protesters are not students, maybe. We've heard that from the universities, but for the students themselves, they're in the universities studying. What is your message to them?
Well, actually, can we just back up? Because I want
Sure.
to, if it's okay, I mean, I want to talk about my discomfort with the right.
Right. Go ahead.
Because you're right? I mean, I think we've seen, Colorado Christian University inviting Jewish leaders, raising money for Israel. And it's like, what's wrong with this? Why are you so concerned with this? I think my concern comes from the fact that they have a very specific vision for the way they want to see things go in Israel. They are clearly very aligned, and this is something we talked about, even in the year prior to October 7th, that there was this close alignment between the settlement movement in the West Bank and Christian evangelicals here in America, and that together they were working to build theological majorities, that they believed in these religious majorities. And so for me, I am incredibly suspicious of the right's embrace of Israel, because I don't know why they're doing it, right? And are they doing it because they see it as furthering a particular worldview and a certain kind of politics? Or are they doing it because they truly embrace the diversity that is Israel. And this kind of takes me to what you asked, which is, and my wife had to convince me not to do this this weekend. I said, I'm going to open up a booth at the Tivoli Square, like Lucy style, with 5 cents at the top, that just says liberal Zionists against the occupation, right? I think my message for these student protesters is to look past the black and white, right? They have neatly organized the world into, Zionists and anti-Zionists, aggressors and victims. And I know that this doesn't fit into their binary, but I really want them to wrestle with the idea that I am a Zionist, that I am a liberal, and that I am opposed to the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that many events have occurred over the past 45 years that have made that difficult. And that I went to Israel in the last 2 years, and I saw how unsustainable and how unjust the isolation of the Gaza Strip was. But that they need to support not Hamas, not Hezbollah, but the moderate, rational actors that represent the Palestinians. And that if people want to support Israel, then supporting Bibi Netanyahu and Ben Gvir and Smotrich, you are in fact supporting the people who are least likely to make peace. And so I guess my message to everyone involved is, don't project your ideas of what you want us to be on us here in America or on Israel. And that we contain multitudes. And I've had some really great conversations with much more moderate people who want to learn. And that's what I've said. Zionism is a family. You've got labor Zionists on the left, not too many today. You've got hard right Christian nationalists on the right. And you've got a whole lot of liberal and more centrist Zionists who just want to live their lives and want to be free and want to be themselves. And so I think my message to the student protesters, my message to some on the right who I feel are almost too exuberantly supportive of this war, is to see us for who we are and not to project your ideology or your worldview or your culture war onto our history and this conflict. And I think if everyone were to do that, we'd be making progress, right? Hamas and Netanyahu are clearly not leading either group responsibly. So what's it going to take for the right leaders? And by the way, that was why I think Chuck Schumer's speech on the Senate floor was so important, that in essence, the highest ranking American Jewish leader in the country got up and said, this war is a travesty and the Netanyahu government has lost its way. And I thought things would change after that, but that's not what's happened.
Now, just really quickly, now obviously there are those on the quote unquote Christian right, may have theological reasons that you noted. It's often very difficult to separate when you're a Christian or a Christian right and when you are supporting, correct me if I'm wrong, the only democratic, small d, liberal democracy that's functioning to the extent that it is, given the resources that it doesn't have than Israel. And so it may be there's a theological viewpoint, and maybe there's a pragmatic alliance with the state of Israel.
Right. And to me, that should be the normative American position. And I think that's what we've seen from President Biden, right? I mean, the vote that we saw take place 2 weeks ago, where $16 billion was sent to Israel for military equipment, right? That was an interesting moment, right? Because the last thing I want to do is put more weapons in Israel's hands to prosecute the war in Gaza. And at the same time, the last thing I want to do is deny Israel the military equipment it needs to fend off an attack from Iran, right? So, I mean, again, like, we just have to embrace the gray here. And I think that, I've been saying this before Jon Stewart said it, but he said it best, like, friends take the keys. If your friend is drunk and about to get into a car and drive themselves into a wall, you take the keys. I've always believed this. I believed this 30 years ago when I was in Americans for Peace Now, and I continue to believe it, that the Hawks are going to destroy the Zionist dream, that this war is going to make things worse. It has isolated America. It has isolated Israel. And I think it's been interesting to watch President Biden, who I can't imagine someone, he's been more supportive of Israelis than Prime Minister Netanyahu. He's the one who flew to Israel to put them in a warm embrace. He's the one who is meeting with hostage families. Netanyahu is not meeting with hostage families, right? So I think that if you truly support Israel, and obviously everyone can debate this, if you truly support Israel, then you have to be there to say you have gone too far. You are eroding your position. You are hurting yourself in terms of military security. And I think what the Iranian attack was so interesting is it showed us that Israel's strength comes from collaboration with partners in the region and its alliances with the Western democracies. So, from my perspective, right, is that friendship does not always mean saying, yes, please do whatever you want. It says, hey, I'm looking at this from a slightly more dispassionate place than you, and I think you're making big mistakes.
Scott, thank you again for your time. I truly appreciate you spending this and explaining your positions. I think our audience, our readers, our subscribers are going to be well served by what you outlined here. Any final comments before we go?
I think just everyone pray for peace, work to see the perspectives on both sides and support the people who you think can bring us to a peaceful end to this war and this conflict so that two people, Palestinians and Israelis, can live in security and peace. And I really thank you for just digging a little deeper because that's what we need. Thank you.
Scott, thank you again for your time, sir. Appreciate it. And hey, enjoy the rest of your day, okay?
Likewise. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.